It's 6:30, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. And as long as you guys don't have anything to say or anything I want to add before we get started, welcome or anything like that. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this Bible study. I'm working with Amarillo MCC to put together a Bible study or a study on the Clobber passages found in the Bible. And tonight our study is actually going to be focusing more on just kind of building a foundation for what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. This is set up to be between 6 and 8 weeks, depending on how our study works. And with that, we may have people asking questions or not. I mean, it just kind of depends. So that may lengthen out our study a little bit. So that's why we've planned for between 6 and 8 weeks. If at any time you can't hear me, please let me know, or if my camera disappears or something. So, but tonight, our first lesson, we're actually going to be looking at just a basic foundation, helping us to build an understanding of where the Clobber passages come from and why the church has used these passages basically to incite anger amongst other church members, as well as to verbally and mentally attack those in the LGBTQ population. So as we get started, let's see if we can... There we go. Okay, so with that, as we get started, before we look at any individual verses, just to kind of understand the history behind the term clobber, the history behind where different belief systems come from in the church, and just to look at those ideas, because these passages have actually gotten so deep into the church mindset that it has developed how Christians believe, what they believe about the LGBTQ population and community as a whole. And so it's important for us to basically arm ourselves with knowledge. And that's, I believe, the biggest thing that a person can do is arm themselves with knowledge so that they can have true and correct statements whenever someone does bring up something that goes against what they believe. So this introduction and this whole study is not about arguing, but it's looking for clarity, compassion, and honesty as we approach Scripture in humility and our courage. This study will recognize, or the study does recognize, that this is a very weighted issue. Many people in both the church who are not LGBTQ and the LGBTQ population have major emotional issues with this, with what we'll be talking about. And this has been used, these verses have actually been used to wound many people. And it's been used to confuse allies and family members, people in our lives. And because of that, like I said, this is a very emotional, taxing thing. So if anybody does have any questions or comments, you can feel free to let us know and drop it in the chat or say it out loud, just kind of up to you. It does help us. Yes, sir.
You want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about who you are?
I might need to do that. It might be good. Okay. My name's Scott Rasco. I'm actually helping Amarillo MCC with this study. I live in San Angelo, Texas. I'm a former full-time pastor and former worship leader. Done a lot of work in church since I was 15 years old. And with that, most of that has been in worship and the word, also in drama and areas, other areas of ministry like youth and stuff. I have a master's degree in Master's of Divinity degree from Hardin-Simmons University, and I got that in '07. So it's been a few years, and hope to go back ultimately and get a PhD. Not for sure if that's going to be in Bible or in education, because I'm also a teacher, a full-time teacher. So anyway, like I said, I'm in San Angelo, Texas now. I come from the Abilene area most of my life. And I just kind of a brief introduction. I lived most of my life, like the first 41 years, trying, like a lot of people do, the best that I could to live the right life, live the way that I'd always been taught, live the way that everyone had told me I needed to live. And then from there, just kind of had an epiphany moment to where I felt like I finally realized what I was doing and how I was treating myself and treating my own beliefs, and it just kind of changed everything for me. And so I came out after that and have been out for the last few years. Currently am working on getting things taken care of for the MCC licensure, and so that's just kind of a process now that I'm working on while I'm working full time at the school. So, any other questions or things y'all I need to answer about that? Are we good? Okay. Yeah, I don't ever think about introducing myself. So, okay. So the Clobber passages that we find out, there's been many books written over this over the past 2 decades or so. The term clobber actually is what it sounds like. It's called clobber because these passages were typically used as an attack or an affront to the LGBTQ people. And because it's been used as a weapon, it actually has, like we said a moment ago, it's done a lot of damage to people's belief systems. It's done a lot of damage to the understanding of many allies and many just Christian people in the Christian community. And for us, our understanding and our way of looking at these scriptures may seem different than the way many churches teach it. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at tonight, is to better understand why the church has taught these passages the way they have. Now, one thing that's before we get there, the clobber passages that we find are actually in Genesis 19, Leviticus 18:22, Leviticus 20:13, Romans 1:26 and 27, 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 10, and 1 Timothy 1:9 and 10. What's so interesting to me, coming from a word background, someone who's very big on understanding biblical culture and how things developed over time, what's so interesting to me is these verses make up less than 1/10 of 1% of the entire Bible. So I actually teach geometry, so math is my area of expertise when it comes to education. And if you think about it, we're talking about taking the Bible, taking 1/10 of the Bible, or I'm sorry, taking the Bible, taking 1% of the Bible, and then dividing that 1% into 10 pieces. You're breaking this down, that these 6 passages are minute compared to the Bible as a whole. But people have actually used these 6 passages over the past 100 years, 150 years, 200 years to do major damage to other people's belief systems. It has shaped the way the LGBTQ community sees themselves. It has shaped the way many families see and view the LGBTQ members of their households, and how the church has experienced the Bible. And it's such a small piece of the whole text, and it has had so much effect on the church as a whole. And to me, that's very amazing, because that's how things happen a lot of times. That's how problems get started in the church, is people take small pieces and allow that to affect everything else they believe. And so the purpose of this study is to help us build a foundation so that we can move beyond fear and actually move to a realm of understanding. So I hope that's what this study does for you guys. So with that, it's important for us to better understand, if we're going to truly understand why the church teaches what they teach, it's important for us to distinguish some different vocab words, or at least some different things like translation, interpretation. We're going to talk about that a little bit first. Um, we look at biblical translations and we see that there are hundreds and hundreds of translations. And basically, a translation is simply taking something from one language into another. We use Google Translate to go from English to Spanish or English to French or other words. Well, basically, scholars would take the original Greek and Hebrew Bible, or I say the original, the latest versions that they have. They would take that and they would change it into their language. Martin Luther changed it into German. There's Latin versions, the Latin Vulgate, which is used by the Catholic Church. And then the English translation, we have many English translations, and these committees meet together and they decide how they're going to translate these words from the Greek and Hebrew into the English language. Well, that sounds great, but the problem is no one gets away from their own interpretation. No one gets away from their own bias. Any group of scholars who come together, whether they're evangelical or traditional or high church or low church or whatever their understanding of the Bible is, they're going to bring that to their interpretation. So while they may be translating from the original text, they are always going to allow their own interpretation, their own belief systems to have bias on how they translate and interpret those words. So, for instance, a Greek word may have 5 different meanings. And they have to go through and say, oh, well, my belief system tends to believe this word means it this way. And so they choose to use that English word. Or they take something that different people would have translated many different ways, but they choose words based on their own belief and their own bias. And so that's where interpretation comes in. And even when a pastor gets up and preaches, interpretation and how we actually break down the Word of God is based on what we believe and what the church believes that we are part of. And so because of that, no interpretation is going to be perfect. There is no interpretation that is completely neutral in the area of the LGBTQ population. However, there is at least a few translations that are affirming or tend to be more affirming, and scholars and progressive Christians recommend. One of those being the NRSV, which is the New Revised Standard Version. And then the New Revised Standard actually has an update that has come out recently, which they call the NRS View. And it's just an updated version of the NRSV. We're going to actually bring up something here in a minute that's kind of interesting to me, so we're not talking about it yet. But there are interpretations that try to be more like gender neutral and more egalitarian, I guess, but they still are going to have one leaning or another. So it's important for us as people to realize that translations always will have the cultural understanding of the people that did the translation. Moreover, the biblical translations are also going to have a contextual and cultural leaning of the people the text is written about. So we look at the Old Testament and we find that from Genesis through Malachi, you have this major shift of the Jewish people, moving from Abraham to Isaac to all of these characters in between, and their understanding, their culture, their biases, their way of belief is so different even throughout the Old Testament. You can just imagine how different it is looking from the beginning of the Old Testament to the end of the New Testament. So when people come and say, well, the Bible doesn't change, or the way God did things doesn't change throughout the Bible, that's not true. The Bible actually changes every, few books. You see God being represented a completely different way in one book than he was in the book before. And if you look at the text of the entire Bible, you can see how people's mindsets changed, how cultural adapted to different understandings, how they went from more of a temple mindset to a rabbinical mindset. You see how things develop over time. Then we are reading this 2,000 years after the Bible was written. So we have an entirely different culture and context than what the people believed in the Old Testament or what the people believed in the New Testament, the time of Jesus, the time of David and Moses and all of these characters we read about. And so we as people have to understand there's a major cultural difference in the beliefs and understanding today than they were 2,000 years ago when the Bible was put together, or even the 1,500 to some people believe up to 6,000 years prior, whenever Abraham lived, and even farther back than that. And the understanding of sex and sexuality was much different today than what it was then. In that day and time, there was no concept of homosexuality. There was no concept of being gay or straight, bisexuality. That wasn't a concept. People didn't understand that. That wasn't something they even thought about. And so because of that, our understanding of sexual orientation is so far different from the biblical understanding of sex that there's really no way to compare the two. So when the church comes and says, oh, well, they're talking about homosexuals in that point, well, they're not. They're not really talking about that because they didn't have a concept of a homosexual. They didn't have a concept of a gay person or a straight person or a queer person or a transgender person. Instead, sex in the biblical times and the Greeks and the Romans and all of these ancient cultures, they dealt with things like power and status. They dealt with honor. And many times sex was used as a way to humble someone, to bring humility or humiliation towards someone, which we'll talk more about next week. But this idea of dominance and submission was very common in the biblical world, as well as the empires of the Greeks, the Persians, and the Romans. Because of that, our understanding of sex today is completely different than their understanding of sex. Their understanding of sex and sexual behavior many times had to do with violence and exploitation, had to do with temple rituals, and mutual same-sex relationships had nothing to do with their understanding. When they would have a same-sex issue in the Bible, it's typically a power struggle. It's typically a form of humiliation. And so, which we'll see again, like I said, next week. They didn't have a concept of a loving same-sex mutual relationship between two consenting adults. I mean, that was just not an issue. And even when we look at the Romans and Greek culture, they got into things like pedophilia and things that to them they felt were okay, but are completely different than our understanding of sex in the 21st century. What they had back then. So the world we live in today is so different and so far removed from the biblical understanding of sex and the biblical understanding of gender that we can't even compare the two. And when the church tries to, they basically undermine their own belief system. Okay, now, with that, I think it's important that we understand where the term homosexual comes from. The word itself, homosexual, actually is a very new concept. The word was developed or was first used and coined in 1869. So we're not even looking at 200 years that the word homosexual has been used. And it was actually created by a German activist, and he was a sexual activist and a human rights activist who was trying to write a letter to a sexologist or a psychologist who deals with sexuality, and in the process coined the German word for homosexual. And basically the word means what homosexual means. It means someone who is sexually attracted to someone of the same gender, or someone who's the same. That's the homo part. And so when he wrote this letter, he wasn't doing it with a negative connotation. However, the word began to take on a negative connotation as it moved into the English language, which didn't even happen until the 1890s. So we're looking at just a little over 125 years that the actual word homosexual from the German moved into the into the English language as we know it today. And in the 1950s, 1952, the American Psychological Association in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, actually began using homosexual as a clinical term to talk about a mental disorder. They entered it into the 1952 version of the DSM as a sociopathic personality disturbance. Okay, that's a lot of big words. Okay, a lot of big words. Basically, in 1952, they put it in their manual for mental disorders as an antisocial disorder of going against the norms of society and the rights of other people. That's basically what a sociopathic personality disturbance is. It's an antisocial disorder where someone is intentionally going against or disregarding social norms. Okay, if you've ever wondered why people say that homosexuality is a choice, this is it. Because basically, while they believed that the actual desire or sexual attraction to someone of the same sex wasn't chosen, the act of homosexual love was a chosen act. And so because of that, that predisposition may have been psychologically built into the person, but choosing to act on that predisposition was chosen. And so that led many people to start saying, oh, well, they chose to be gay. They chose to be queer. They chose to be homosexual. And that concept actually has led even into the church culture of the 21st century. There's still many churches that completely believe that being gay is a choice. And it all started in the 1952 understanding of mental disorders when they claimed that homosexuality was a mental disorder. In 1968, the DSM-2 actually reclassified it as a sexual deviation, basically just saying that it was deviating from the traditional sexual norms. In 1973, they had a major attack against the APA, or the American Psychological Association, from activists, of gay activists, as well as people who studied sexuality. And they fought against and even led to the removal of homosexual from the DSM. The problem was, even though they chose in 73 to remove it from the new the DSM-2 revision, they didn't actually remove the disorder. They just removed the word. And so they still believed that sexual orientation disturbance was a real thing, and that homosexuals, all gays, basically had a sexual orientation disturbance. But they defined it as someone being distressed with their orientation. That was how it was defined in their text. Finally, in 1980, the DSM-3 came out, and they again used the same definition, but they called it ego-dystonic homosexuality, which basically just means that a person is distressed or unaccepting of their orientation. And then when we moved to 1987, they finally removed homosexuality from the DSM as a disorder altogether. So over about a 100-year period of time, the word was coined in the late 1860s, then was changed from being just a common term for an individual to being a clinical term for a mental disorder. And then by 1987, they actually decided, hey, we're not going to say it's a mental disorder anymore. Instead, we're not even going to focus on homosexuality itself as a sexual deviation. All of that being said, nowhere in from the 1860s to the late 1900s, if that's when the word homosexual comes up, there's no way that a biblical author could use the term homosexuality. It was not a biblical word. It wasn't used by a biblical author. It wasn't used in ancient cultures. And the Bible itself never spoke of homosexuals as we think of as gay individuals, people who love someone from the same gender, someone from the same sex. There was no concept of trans people, there was no concept of bisexuality. None of that existed prior to the modern era that we have over the last 200-300 years. Homosexuality was first mentioned in the biblical context in 1946 whenever the Revised Standard Version, which I think that's so crazy because progressive Christians say to use the new Revised Standard Version as a more inclusive version, but the old Revised Standard was the one that actually introduced homosexuality as a term in the Bible. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if they were trying to react to the old Revised Standard Version when they made the new one, and they were just trying to make up for that. But basically, in 1 Corinthians 6:9, two words were combined as homosexuals. So when it was written out, it lists this list of things that Paul was writing about, and then instead of using these two Greek words, they just plugged in the word homosexuals as the term. Now we'll talk more about that in a few weeks, so I don't want to really get into that. But this was a very controversial thing, even amongst the committee themselves. The people who were translating the RSV, they argued about whether to use the word homosexual or not. It wasn't something that it was cut and dry, yes, that's what that means. It was, they didn't understand what the Greek words meant. And so because of that, they just decided to plug the word homosexual in as the word they thought might fit what that's talking about. This was a major turning point in history. It was not a theological concept. Instead, it was a translation change. And prior to that, the only word that was used that we use today that was actually used in the Bible that could be talking about homosexual is the word sodomite. And that was in the King James Version from 1611. What's interesting is sodomite was never used to talk about gay men. The word sodomite was used for the word kadesh, which means male prostitute. And so in their temple, the pagan temples rather, they had these male prostitutes that would come in and do things as an act of worship to whoever their pagan god was. They were called sodomites in the Old Testament, in the King James Version and some of the older versions in the English. One thing this does bring up is by the 1600s, there was the concept that Sodom and Gomorrah may have had to do with homosexuality. That developed as far back as the 1600s. However, as we'll learn next week, that's really not where that's going from. But it was a development in the Christian worldview of the Middle Ages, basically. The Middle Ages and all the things that happened during the Middle Ages affected how people believed. And because of that, they began using terms like sodomite and stuff for gay individuals. But again, even the word itself in the biblical text, it's not found in the biblical text. The Hebrew word is kadesh, and it refers to a male prostitute, never a gay individual. Okay. That's a lot of information I know I'm throwing at you, but, anyway. So if anyone does have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to make, feel free to cut in and interrupt me. So, okay. As I said earlier, one thing that we have to realize is the Old Testament. Yeah, I missed some of my slides, so we're good. The cultural difference that we have today is so much different than the cultural differences that we find in the Bible. You find in the Old Testament this understanding of God being a vengeful, angry, hateful God. The New Testament culture, God is now seen as being a loving, compassionate God. So even in the changes throughout the biblical texts, the worldview changed dramatically. And we see that in things like our understanding of of how men and women react to one another. Um, if you think about the Old Testament and even some in the New Testament, men are, it's very, very chauvinistic. Everything is run by the men. Women are basically subservient. And in 21st century America, that's not the culture that we live in. But so many times people go back and say, well, women shouldn't do this, or men shouldn't do this, or gays shouldn't be allowed to be ordained, or whatever their belief system is, and they base it on this very old, archaic understanding that they find from what they believe the Bible said, not realizing that today's culture is so far different than their culture then, that it's a completely different worldview. And so that's important for us to acknowledge as we begin moving into these texts. Another thing that I want us to understand is the church, the reason why the church really began to focus on sexual issues the way they did was based on Victorian sexual morality. And leading up to the Victorian time is where taboos and things came from, like the missionary position. They actually taught when the missionaries would come over from Europe to the Native Americans, they would teach that the only way to truly have sex that was allowed by God was missionary position. And this came from the mindset of that it should be the man who's doing the action. There's this whole moral taboo that developed because of this. And it is still in our church culture today. I mean, the sexual taboos that the church sees today is still based on this 16, 17, 1800s and their understanding of sex. Well, the Victorian sexual morality actually believed that women weren't allowed to enjoy sex. That sex was a man's thing, that men could basically were hypersexually aggressive, that they would go out and have sex with anybody they wanted to during the Victorian time, but women weren't allowed to enjoy sex. It was just for procreation. And that was where the modern understanding in the church of sexuality comes from. And for that, as I said, that all of these taboos came about, especially when it came to sex that was not the traditional religious understanding of sex. Then we move into the 21st century or the 20th century, and we get this major purity culture that develops. While we think of the sexual liberation that came in the 70s, 60s, and 70s with the hippies and Woodstock and all those things, in the church culture, there was this major push for purity. We find things like true love waits, waiting until you're married to have sex. There was this major push, and everyone that ever went to a youth camp probably heard about the importance of being celibate until you're married. That was a very big thing, and that was a 21st century or a 20th century purity culture coming out in the basic understanding of the church. There was also major political cultural wars. You had the church or the conservatives who believed that everything should be this certain way. You had the non-conservatives, liberal, left, however you want to call it, that believed things should be this way. Then you had the people in the middle that believed this way. And so all of these different belief systems coming together led many people to carry this very strong self-shame mindset of their own sexuality, whether they were straight, gay, lesbian, bi, whatever. They began to feel like sexuality was dirty and was unclean, and homes didn't talk about sex. Families didn't talk to their kids and get them ready for marriage by talking to them about, well, this is what sex is and this is how sex happens. Instead, they just basically left people to figure it out on their own. And so the schools began taking over that basic lack in understanding and began teaching people sex ed. And that's why sex ed became so big in the mid 1900s and even now today, because so many homes basically feel like talking about sex is wrong. It's something dirty. They shouldn't be talked about. And then with the shift in religious beliefs, with the RSV adding the word homosexual to the translation, that actually shifted away a lot of people thought. And it has basically shaped church and sexuality over the last 100 years. I mean, it's taken it from where it was before to now what we see in the Christian church. And as you know, the Christian church, sexuality is just something you don't talk about unless you're talking about it in a sinful way. You know, they condemn sex before marriage. They condemn sex that is not the typical traditional how they believe sex should be. And it's all come from these different things throughout the last couple of 100 years, and which is completely different than the shift beforehand. So, setting our expectation for this study, I know that's a lot of information, and the other studies, the other sessions will not be this information forward, but it's important for us to kind of develop this understanding now. So each week we will be focusing on a different passage, and there are basically 6 passages that are called the Clobber passages. And we listed them earlier, but found in Genesis. There's 2 in Leviticus, one in, you have the one in Corinthians, you have the one in Romans, and the one in Timothy. And all of these passages, we're going to take a look at them individually, because there are different important beliefs that we can develop and understand. And if we keep in mind that we're looking at an ancient culture compared to 21st century culture, it'll help us better understand where their theology was and what they actually meant in their context. Because just like the context of someone in Africa is different than the context of someone in America or Asia, the context of today's society is so different than what it was back then that something they were talking about then may have a total different meaning than what it does now. Next, while we are looking at historical context language, we are going to be looking at some theology. The goal of this is not for debate. It's not for arguing or people to come in and try to tear one another down in their belief system. However, we are going to be open to the opportunity of exploration, can't talk, the opportunity of exploration into different beliefs. And so if someone has a different understanding that they want to mention, there won't be any shame in mentioning that, but we're not here to argue. We're not here to try to argue with one another about what we believe. Instead, we're just trying to explore and better understand ourselves and what we believe. Everyone is invited to ask questions and explore things openly, so feel free, if you come and you have a question, feel free to ask that question. Feel free to butt in, feel free to put it in the chat, something like that, just to have an opportunity to get clarification. And our main goal is to honor Scripture, is to truly look at what the Bible's saying and understanding it in their context, their culture, and how that then relates to us in the 21st century America. So this is not about rewriting the Bible. It's not about rewriting Scripture or altering what people believe. It's about true, honest understanding to where we can read the Bible carefully and compassionately without condemning people, without treating people with hatred and anger. And so, as you can tell from this, our main goal is to help us get a historical awareness, a more accurate understanding of the Bible, to where we can be compassionate to one another and be committed to truth. And that's probably the most important part, is being committed to trying to understand the truth of the biblical text so that we're not throwing it in one another's faces and trying to condemn one another, trying to bring shame and hatred. Instead, trying to focus on truth and love. So, anyway, that's pretty much what I have for tonight. So if there are any questions or comments, anything you guys want to say or anything like that, feel free. You can unmute and say it.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. That way we can be more
Yeah, no, it's
eased
good.
in answering the questions. So I stopped the recording. So feel free to ask any questions or make any comments you'd like.
The only comment I was going to make was I hope in this that it gives everybody the ability when they're talking to people who have been hurt by the church to have, a better explanation to them when they say, well, they said this or they said that, to help, because I know at the festival